Once you have keywords that you're ready to use for your site, you want to make sure that the actual content on your page is set up in a way so that you're going to maximize your chances of ranking your page in search engine results and that you're going to rank as highly as possible. Now, this process, while it can sound kind of intimidating to try to break down the algorithm to figure out what exactly you'll need to do, is actually a relatively simple process that you can use where even if you make some mistakes, you'll still be like 70, 80, 90% of the way there in terms of doing good on-page SEO. As you can see on the screen here, there's also a guide on our site called the Spoon-Fed 4-Step Guide to On-Page SEO. Now, while this says it was published 3 weeks ago, it was actually published elsewhere probably like 1 to 2 years ago. So some of this might be just a little outdated, although about 90% of it is still going to be accurate. So anything that's in that guide that is outdated will be covered in this video as well in a more up-to-date fashion. This guide will go over 5 steps to on-page optimization. First, we're going to go over the actual way that you're going to convey semantic meaning to search engines, so how to actually make your page, your article specifically, rank for particular terms in search engines and to establish that your page is about those terms. Second, we're going to talk about the factors that go into on-page optimization that are more focused on the click-through rate rather than on actually getting your site to rank by conveying what the page is about to the search engine robots. Third, we're going to talk about how you're going to want to structure your articles when you're writing them in an external docx type file, and even if you aren't writing them there, even if you only use, for example, the WordPress editor, how you're going to want to instruct other people, such as content writers, to prepare their content so you can easily import it to whatever content management system you are using or however your site is set up. Fourth, we're going to talk about how you can actually hire people for content writing. Now, you might think this is relatively straightforward. You would just give them some money, and then they would do a good job and not do a bad job, and everything would be perfect, and you would just upload it all immediately and with magic, or not magic, with your skill. However, in practice, there are a lot of relatively small issues that can cause problems that you might not know about, and there are some tricks to prevent those that will save you, well, really even hours of work. That's not even really an exaggeration. And finally, we're going to talk about how to actually upload the posts to your site, and it's going to vary a little bit based on your content management system, but we'll talk a little bit about how to interact with content from a docx or a writer or however, to even if there are some formatting issues or so on, how we can standardize all of that to work with whatever CMS you are working with. There are a lot of different parts to a web page. There's the title, there are more subheadings and more titles, there's the actual text, and within the text you have different types of text. You have bulleted lists, you have bold text, italic text, and so on. And so when people start talking about keyword optimization, on-page optimization, they often start listing this massive list of things, and you got to put your keyword here, you got to put your keyword there, you got to do whatever, and so on. Sir, if you bold your keywords, we'll get page 1 rankings. This is some shit that I've literally had people tell me. Also, if you want to hear more shit that I've heard people tell me, what is that? There's like an article like 5 SEO myths or something. Yeah, we'll link that in the comments. However, while there's a bunch of different fields people will list, really, there are 3 fields. There are 3 fucking fields that make up like 60, 70, maybe 80% of your on-page optimization, and they're obscenely straightforward. There's your title. So not this. This is an H1 tag, but the actual title tag within the page, the one that shows up here. And if you look up like some query, the title is generally going to be what's shown here. Like almost always, the title is going to be shown there. Maybe it'll be truncated. The title tag, not the H1. The second thing is the URL structure, and you can see on 256 kilobytes. This is part of why we have our URLs have the actual keywords in them. I mean, it also helps with readability, but this also helps signal to search engines what this page is actually about. And fun fact, the URLs actually add this on the end purely for visibility reasons. If you delete this and just go to this page with the ID, it will regenerate that regardless of what snippet you put in here. So having a URL structure that includes your keyword or your main keyword generally. And then finally, The first heading in your article is also going to be very important. Generally, that's going to be an H1. So the title of your article, so you can think of this as the title, but it's not the literal title tag, it's the title of the post. So that'll generally be an H1. It might be coded differently depending on your site. The standard is to use an H1, although you can also use something else. Now, you have the question of, well, what actually should you put in your URL, your title tag, and your article's main heading, or your H1? And the answer to that is that it can vary based on what you're actually writing about, what your goal is, what your keywords are. A good rule of thumb, if you're not sure, is that generally you'll have a few different keywords. You'll have a main keyword that you're trying to rank for, generally the thing with the most search volume, that's the hardest to rank. And then you'll have some important keywords that are also pretty valuable, maybe a little easier, maybe a little more specific. And then finally, you'll have some kind of general long tails, LSI keywords, to use the guru term, and those will be the more numerous and less important. And a good rule of thumb for those three main fields is that you can use your main keyword either verbatim in those fields, if applicable and if it's natural. Now, you don't have to only use your keyword as the exact match for the title and the other fields that we're talking about. You can also use a phrase match. We're working with the keywords from the previous keyword research video guide, so I think our main one is best clippers for black hair. We don't have to literally title our article best clippers for black hair. A few options that would be phrase match for that would be something like, are these clippers the ultimate best clippers for black hair? ? So some kind of clickbait perhaps, and we have the exact phrase in there. Or we might have something like best clippers for black hair, and then you might have like the pipe character or a separator, and then say top 10 brands reviewed or something. So you might have something else to mix in there. You might include it in part of a sentence or so on. It depends on the exact keyword. So don't worry too much about having an exact match. You could even have it be maybe not in the exact order, depending on what the keyword is. Although if you're not sure, it's generally a safe bet to use an exact match within a phrase somewhere. You can also have some variation between the title tag, the URL, and the article's title for humans, I suppose, the H1. So generally the title is going to be something that you want to be relatively short. Generally somewhere between 60 to 80 characters is a good bet. You want to make sure the full thing will ideally fit onto search engine result pages, although generally if it doesn't fit, it'll still handle it relatively well. You have a little more flexibility in terms of length with the title for humans within your post. So for example here, we can have as much space as we want because this is actually going to be on our site rather than needing to fit the specifications to fit into a search engine result page. So we have a little more flexibility here. So if we wanted to have something a little longer, you might have a slightly different title here. The URL, one thing you can do if you're not necessarily trying to customize your URL too obsessively is that you can, for your URL, you generally want to have similar practices to the title tags, so you generally don't want to be too long. I usually cap my URLs at 255 characters. I believe that's actually the slug I think caps at 255 characters. So it'll automatically generate this slug from the post title. But if it's longer than a certain length, it'll keep this title in here, the human title, but it will crop out the amount that it's going to put into that URL there. In general, your URL can be just the same title as your post, but converted to lowercase with dashes. Generally, you want to use dashes rather than underscores. Google will understand underscores fine, although the convention is that if you have an underscore, it'll be treated as one word, whereas a dash will be two words. That's not always the case, but there are some scenarios where that's true. So generally, it's a good practice to use dashes to separate words in any kind of like computer-related thing, if you want it to be thought of as separate words. You also want to note that your URL is actually going to be visible in search results pages. So if we look at like nice dogs or something, we can actually see the URL there. So that is one other thing that you can customize, not just for conveying semantic meaning to search engines, but also for helping improve your click-through rate by conveying to users that your page is about a particular thing. So that's one more thing that you can customize. You can also set this up to show as breadcrumbs. Let's see if there's, yeah, this is breadcrumbs, which we'll talk a little bit more about later with the schema/structured data markup, which Steve has also written a post on that we'll link as well. I mean hash brown. Hash brown, not fucking Stee. That hash brown has also written a post. So let's apply this formula for the title, H1, and the URL to this keyword, best clippers for black hair, which we're going to actually write an article on. So let's start by talking about the title tag. Now, as mentioned, the title tag, we generally want to keep that relatively short, generally 80 or 60 to 80 characters. And it can also depend, like if your title is W at, like the at sign, and it's very wide, they're not using monospace characters. So if your title is like LLLLLLLL, you could actually make it longer. So it depends a little bit. But anyway, a good formula for what you can do, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but one thing you might do takes into account both the optimization for conveying the semantic meaning to search engines, but also the importance of trying to get a good click-through rate is that you can take your main keyword, so best clippers for black hair, and then we can do a space, a pipe character, and then another space, and then we'll have our keyword or our title, and then we'll have like a benefit. So best clippers for black hair. The fourth one will surprise you. It probably won't surprise you, but whatever. So something like that, or we might say 90% of consumers are satisfied. Now, you probably actually want to make sure that statistic is true, and you're not just like talking out of your ass. But one thing that is a good idea is any kind of number is generally fairly eye-catching. There's also another article that we have about like how to customize your search result appearance, and there's some other weird tricks you can do. Like there's a way to have a special bold character where it's not literally bold, it's literally coded as a bold character, so you can make your search results be bold. There are some emojis that you can put into these search results. There are some gimmicks you can do, but really the gimmicks aren't the important part. The important part is having your keyword in there, and then ideally having some other kind of benefit for why the user should click through. So we'll say, and this statistic I just made up here, although you probably want to actually make sure you know what you're talking about if this were a real article. If you're using Google Sheets or a similar spreadsheet tool, and you want to check how long your title is, this len function will help you out. We're at 77 characters, so that's within the range of 60 to 80, which is probably fine. Now that we have our title, let's create our heading for the actual article. The first thing we're going to want to do here, we'll copy paste this, and then we're going to go to this pipe character. Now the pipe character is nice as a separator in search results because it's very narrow, so there's no monospace font, which means narrow characters are helpful in terms of saving some space there. It's kind of a standard to use, but in our actual title, it generally looks a little bit weird to use this pipe character, so let's change this to a colon. And then we'll make the title a little bit longer because we can, and we can add a few more details here. And one thing we might do is, since we can add a few more details, we might actually try to incorporate a little bit from some of our more important keywords that aren't just our main keyword. Since our main keyword is already covered from the H1, or the title, and we're going to cover it with the URL as well. So we don't necessarily need to be worrying about having an exactly perfect match for that keyword. So let's have the best trimmers and clippers for African American men's hair. So we actually don't have the phrase African American in here, but that's fine because there's probably going to be some long tails, so putting that in there into the heading can also help convey some semantic meaning related to one of the most commonly used alternate phrasings for one of the main terms in our keyword. And you can see we also incorporated the word trimmers, since some of these are about trimmers, or maybe they're not. I guess they aren't. Whatever. We're going to put it in there anyway, just for the sake of example, and we might also, if we had done more research, we might have also found some keywords about trimmers. And we could even do a little bit more and say 20 minutes per haircut with quality clippers from Wall, Andis, and other top brands. And you can see we've managed to incorporate not just the main keyword, which we did here, but we also managed to incorporate some of the main parts of the other keywords into this title so we could convey some of that meaning about the general topics within the article. Now for the URL, if you had something in specific that you wanted to try to fit in here, or maybe you had two, like one very important keyword, you might want to try to put that in the URL to give that a little bit of weight. For this scenario, what I would do is literally just take this URL and then we can make it lowercase and copy paste this here, substitute, and we're going to replace all the spaces with dashes. And we'll take this, put this here. There is a way to also like automatically remove punctuation, but I'm not going to try that hard right now. But there is a way to do it like that if you want to have a URL, or if you wanted to bulk generate these URLs and not have to manually cut that out. If you're using WordPress, I believe it will also automatically essentially do what we just did here, make it lowercase and then remove any punctuation as well. And if you're worried that your URL is too long, some people like to remove certain stop words as they are known. So if it was something like the best hair clippers, you might remove the word the and just say best hair clippers. If you had something like the word in or the word a, the, and you might remove some of those words if you were worried about the URL being particularly long. It's generally not a particularly important issue. With these three fields, we've really covered about, again, 60 to 80% of on-page optimization. Those are really going to be the most important fields in terms of particularly conveying the semantic meaning of your article and making sure that it's clear to search engines that this is the main focus of this topic or this article. Although they also have substantial impacts on your click-through rate, particularly the title, and the URL certainly impacts that as well. Before we get to the actual article writing, there are two other aspects to on-page SEO that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about the meta description, and we're also going to talk about structured data. So the meta description is a tag looks like this, and this is where you describe your page. Traditionally, this section under here has been the meta description. So whatever the site sets as their meta description is what's going to show up here. In current year, 2019, it is not always the case that this is the meta description. In fact, it's increasingly more common for Google to decide to show whatever snippet they happen to think is most relevant to the particular query based on their own discretion. However, very frequently it still is, in fact, the snippet that's shown. And that's particularly true for example, a brand page, so your home page, or if they're looking for something very general, it's pretty common for the meta description to be what's shown. And you can see like here, this is probably not the meta description. These are probably some excerpts cut together. So it's a good idea to have something in here that is going to help people actually click through to the article. You can include your keywords in there if you would like, although you can also basically just write whatever the fuck you want that will get the best click-through rate. It conveys some meaning to search engines, but it's nowhere near as important as the title, H1, and the URL. So if you want to try to fit another keyword in there, you can, but it's definitely more important to avoid overstuffing this section and to focus on getting a good click-through rate from your meta description. One other major way that you can use on-page optimization to improve your click-through rate is to use structured data. Now, in front of me is an article by Hash Brown, which discusses in a fair amount of depth with a number of examples how to use structured data and the various formats and the various different types of structured data that you can use. I would recommend that you check out this article as well, as it will cover this in much more depth than this tutorial. All I'm going to say on this for now is that if you think, for example, you might be able to have something like a star rating, so if you have a product review page and maybe you let your users vote and you'll show an aggregate score, maybe you want to show your own rating if you're reviewing a number of different things. The star ratings here can definitely improve click-through rate. There's also, for example, the best answer structured data markup that you can add for example, I think Quora uses it. I think Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange might use it. There's also structured data for example, article carousels. So if you'll see like these, actually there's, well, this is videos, but it's similar in concept. There's an article carousel thing that you can do. If you look up like, probably like Trump is going to show one. Yeah, like these kinds of carousels. Check this article out. It's very high quality. It is by Hash Brown, and it'll go into some more depth. Jump to links are one more thing you might keep in mind. They're very similar to structured data, and you might think they are from structured data, but they are not. I believe one of these had one of these links. Actually, this is where they pull these from as well. So you can see there's an anchor and it'll link to this particular place. So we didn't appear here, we appeared wherever this is. Here. Here. I guess it doesn't do that when you reload. These are jump to links. And the way that you get these to be set up is that you have to set up a table of contents, and it must link to the sections using the anchors. So anchor here, and we can see if we click this, it jumps us down here, and it has a nice smooth scroll effect, but you don't actually need that. So that's all you actually have to do for these, is just have a table of contents that lines up with your headings and have the anchors go down to those IDs. But it needs the IDs because otherwise it can't link you to those particular sections. And these are under the post, but you'll also sometimes see them actually link to specific places in the post. Like this, yeah, this is the jump to link as well. And it takes us right down to number 13. We already have these set up to work on 256 kilobytes. Ideally, you don't want to be making all of these manually, since that's kind of a pain in the ass for a variety of reasons. There's probably a WordPress plugin that will do it for you. And there's also a post on our site that covers how to actually make these links in PHP directly if you are using a solution that would work with. The last few things we're going to talk about briefly in terms of the elements in your page are the headings, so the subheadings, not the main one, but the H2s, H3s, H4s, and so on, and then the actual paragraphs. So we've talked mainly about our main keywords at this point, so our best clippers for black hair, but we also have these important and supplementary keywords. What we'll show in a little more depth in a minute when we get to actually writing this article is how to structure this, but the general thing you're going to keep in mind is your main keyword for the title, H1, and so on, and then you'll have your important keywords. Generally, you want to include them in the headers. So we'll do an example of an H2, or an H2. And again, we don't necessarily need to do an exact match, but a phrase match is generally a good idea. So let's look at one of these over here. So we have this, and it might be kind of awkward to just have a bunch of headings. These might be maybe these 4 or 5 are your main keywords. It might be kind of awkward to just have verbatim the same, very similar headings. These are actually pretty similar. You might have a little more variety in your keywords depending on what you're going for. So it might be awkward to do this exactly like this, but we might have one of the headings in our post be something like best clippers for and we might even adjust this a little bit. So say we've changed this around just a little bit because you don't want to sacrifice the quality of your article just by shoving keywords in there. That doesn't even necessarily help you to obsessively shove exact match keywords everywhere in your article, especially with something like this where the keyword is so similar that we're not necessarily needing to convey that exact match. If we had a little bit more variety in these keywords, it might be worth it to go for something a little more similar or a little closer to the exact match for those important but not main keywords in your headings. Now, the lower importance keywords, you generally aren't going to need to put them in headings. It's generally more than enough to try to include them somewhere in a paragraph, even if you're changing around the order of words a little bit or using them as a phrase match, maybe adding a word somewhere in the middle and so on. Now that we have our article roughly planned out, what we're going to do is actually show how to put these keywords into an article in a word processing software. We'll use Google Sheets. The process here is going to be the same using LibreOffice or Microsoft Word or whatever it is that Mac OS has. So we'll paste these in here, and you can use Control-Shift-V to paste without formatting, so this way we are just getting the actual text and not fucking up our formatting. Now, one thing you want to know about this is that Google Sheets or Google Docs or whatever the fuck this is, any word processing application, you have actual headings. So this, if we just bold some shit and center it and make it large, that looks like a heading. This is not a fucking heading. This is not a heading. It is not coded as a heading. It looks like a heading. A human will say it's a heading, but it is not a heading. This is important because we're not publishing this in a docx. We are trying to import this to our site. And there's a few ways to import a document to your site, but they all involve somewhere either directly or behind the scenes converting this into HTML. So if you use this and you use heading 1, this, with the methods that we talk about later, this will convert correctly to an H1. This fucking, like, random centered shit with bold text or whatever. This is not going to fucking convert to an H1. Don't do that shit. Do this shit. H1, H2, and so on and so forth. Now, we're actually going to cheat real quick. We're going to go back here, and we're going to use the function proper, and we're just going to run this through here. We're going to do this, and we're actually going to grab the uppercase versions of these. We can also use control and then the backslash if we want to remove styling. Oh, that doesn't remove headings, so I don't know why I did that. But if you have, like, this, that's a complete side note because it doesn't remove headings. All right, just kidding, LOL. But now we have the proper case version of this. So let's go ahead and we'll grab our title. Well, we actually don't need our title yet. We'll grab our H1. And this looks a little bit long in this document. It actually is a little bit long of a title, but depending on your site style sheet, this might show up perfectly fine. It kind of will depend on how your site's actually coded. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to structure out this article that I am definitely not going to write into the full depth, but we'll do a quick overview. So we're going to say this is the main keyword. These keywords are basically the same, so we'll say these are combined going to be one keyword. And we'll take this one and then this one. So we'll say this is 4/5 as the main, or 3/4 keywords. For important keywords, we'll use the rest as supplementary. Actually, no, we're going to take the bold one too. So we'll take, first of all, this H2. And both of these are really already covered in this H2, essentially. So we're going to, because this keyword is actually inside of this keyword, so they're both covered, really. So we're going to remove those. We'll have an H2. We'll put a little space here. We're going to type some more in a minute. H2. And let's look at these keywords. So we have best clippers for black hair. This is our main one. We already did this one. Best hair clippers for black hair, and then the best hair clippers for black hair. So we can combine this into one. And that's now one keyword. And we'll use this in one more H2. And we're going to put this one at the end, actually. So let's see. What should we do for this first one? The best hair clippers for black hair. And we'll say, so we might have a little introduction here. Then our first H2, which has our keyword worked into it. Some content here. And then we might talk about these. Then we might say bonus. So this might be a little section afterwards. We might incorporate this somewhere in here. And then we probably will have some H3s in here where we say like brand 1, brand 2, H3s. So they're all within this section and so on and so forth. And we'd put our affiliate links in here as well. Then for our third keyword, put it in another H2. And we have like a conclusion down here. And now we have these last ones in here, so we can incorporate them probably either in H3, so we might say down here. And we can even remove this end part we already covered for black hair like 17 times, or we could put it in here. Same with these, you might do this one similarly. And we might even have, if you had more of these ones about like lining hair, or you could even just, actually probably just do this in here. So you can see we're just taking these, they're going in H3s here, but you could probably just do them in paragraphs depending on your exact keywords. So these less important ones can be keywords in paragraphs, H3s, kind of depends on how long your article is. If we were going to do 10 whole examples, we might actually grab more keywords than this, because this would be a pretty long article for just, well, you could fit more in, is what I will say. One final thing that you're going to want to think about when you're writing a post for your site is about the internal link structure and the general implications there for how that's going to impact what sites on your page are perceived as important based on the PageRank algorithm or the off-brand PageRank algorithm, or if we're talking about Bing, and so on and so forth. A quick crash course here for how the PageRank algorithm works, and yes, that is in fact still used, even though you cannot access the data publicly. The concept is the same as it has been since it was created. There are both internal and external links that are taken into account. And there are also different tiers of links that are taken into account. So if you consider two scenarios, scenario one, I have a web page and it has one link pointed to it, and then scenario two, it's that same web page, but I have a web page, there's a link pointed to my web page, and that article itself has many links pointed at that. So that link is going to be stronger than if I had a link from a page that did not have any links. The same is true for your site's internal links. So if there's a page on your site that is particularly important, then it is useful to have internal links that are pointed to your more important pages, as that is a tool that you can use to indicate to search engines that particular pages are more important than other pages. So you can effectively, with your articles, funnel authority around your site, and you have some control over what pages are going to be considered the most important. So if you have some other articles on your site that are particularly important, particularly competitive, or so on, perhaps not even competitive, it's sometimes advantageous to focus very hard on the easiest terms and win really hard in that area. But you have a term that you're focused on, or a page that you're focused on, it is a good idea to interlink between this post that you're writing right here and the other particularly important posts on your site. There is also another guide that is actually around 3 or so years old, maybe not quite 3 years old, probably like 2 years old, that is on internal linking, and I'll link that below this video as well if you want a more detailed crash course on the general concepts that go into internal. Now, particularly if you're trying to generate a lot of content for something that is really not super interesting, so for example, an affiliate product review site or some kind of site where you just need content, it doesn't have to be amazing, it is often a good idea, especially if you need bulk content, to hire people. However, content writers often are mediocre or they don't know exactly what you want. So there's a few ways that we can try to narrow this down to get the best results possible. First of all, we're going to grab this, we're going to open a new tab, and we are going to paste transposed. And we're going to go ahead and plan out this spreadsheet here, which is going to be how we're going to keep track of our posts, and then we're going to provide some information to our writers. Now, what we want to do here is we want to, when we're planning out these posts, before we give these to the writers at all, let's say we're doing 20, as mentioned, the title H1 and the URL are the most important aspects of that post, as well as the meta description, to some extent for click-through rate. So what we want to do is we want to actually write all these fields personally before we go and we hire our writers. Now, what some people will do instead is they'll just give their writers the keyword, and they'll say, write this and put this in the post, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a few problems that you run into there. First of all, the title is often terrible, the H1 is often terrible, the URL, well, they usually don't set the URL themselves anyway, but those fields that are particularly important, they might do a bad job on. And it's not just that they'll do a mediocre job, or they might not quite get how to optimize those particular fields. The other thing is that they will often pick the boringest fucking topic in the world. So if you give them a topic of best clippers for black hair, it will be very common for them to do something like title an article called, "Here are the 10 best clippers for black hair." If your keyword is how to buy boots, their article will literally be called like how to buy boots. And that's so fucking boring, I'd rather put a handgun in my mouth and pull the fucking trigger than read that article. Now, while we don't exactly need to have a masterpiece, what we can also do with these fields while we're planning this out is provide a little bit of guidance for something at least mildly fucking interesting that the writers can do. So A, they have something to talk about, especially if you're giving them like a 1,000-word article. But B, so your site's not completely boring. So for example, here we actually already have a little bit of some guidance here. So how people can save time. So a specific sub-point about best clippers for black hair. So we still have the keyword targeted, but we have something a little bit unique to our site that's going to help us stand out. You could also do trollier things. For example, you might say something like, "We asked Will Smith what the best clippers for black hair are. Here's his shocking reply." So you might not actually have access to Will Smith, so you might say like, things Will Smith said about black people hair clippers in a fucking interview or something, either referencing some news story or something like that, or like the top 10 best haircuts that I've seen and the clippers you can get them with, or something. You can put a little bit of spice into your title, and that reflects in what the writer actually creates, and you get something a lot more interesting rather than these super generic, and also, I suppose, if you want to use a technical-ish term, thin, I suppose, content. So you can get a little more power there, and your site will also look less spammy. It'll also improve your click-through rate, and that can help with your site's general profitability. We also segment these into main, important, and supplementary keywords, which we'll talk about in just a second with the instructions. And you can also put your meta descriptions here, and that's more for elaborating on what you kind of want the writer to talk about in your article. And with this process, what you can do by planning this out and giving all of this information to your writers is that you actually end up doing like 60 to 80% of the heavy lifting for this article, even though you're only spending like 5 to 10% as much time as your writers are going to be putting into this, but you get all the actual results. You also want to make sure that you're relatively explicit in your guidelines for writers. Here's a short snippet of what you might post in the instructions for writers. You want to make sure that you're very specific, and ideally that you use some examples as well. You might have some examples of good niche-related sources here, for example. Because first of all, writers are often going to be way shittier than you would even expect. They will often not understand really simple things. And that's partially because they're fucking incompetent. And it's also sometimes because they either don't know that much about SEO, or they're unfamiliar with the topic, or they just don't care and they do a shitty job. So you want to be pretty explicit in what your actual instructions are. What you might also do is include a link for the authors as an example of the kind of content that you are trying to produce. So either something you already wrote on your site that you think is a good example, or if you have a new site, you don't have any content yet, you could link to a competitor site that you think does a good job of exemplifying the kind of content that you're looking for. And I'll post this snippet below this post as well, and you can use this verbatim if you want. It's also a good idea to request that writers send you at least their first article directly before you have them go and do an entire set, so that you can actually review that and make sure everything is correct. And if there's something that isn't correct with the guidelines, you should tell the fucking writer and not let them write the other 17 fucking articles and keep doing that thing wrong, because then you have to go fix it. So make sure you actually give them your feedback. For example, make sure to use the fucking heading 1. Make sure to use the keyword. Don't use Wikipedia. Don't use this source. Try to use this kind of a source. Now, once you finish with that, you'll get an article back. It'll look something like this, but with actual content in it. If you're using WordPress or whatever, you should be able to just copy-paste this in to the editor and get this to actually transfer correctly, since it is using the correct markup. If you want to remove styling, if they did some weird, stupid shit, like they have like highlighting or something stupid like this, and that's not going to transfer correctly, it's going to look stupid, you can also use Control-A and then Control-Backspace and remove all the styling and still keep these headings. So you should be able to just copy-paste this in if you use WordPress, although if you have a lot of blog posts, like 30 or whatever, that still might be kind of a pain in the ass. Or for other reasons, depending on your editor, you might need to get this to be in HTML format. So there's a few ways we can do this. So let's say we have the docx. There are tools that will do like docx to HTML. Let's just download like 4 copies of this and see. Yeah, this is way faster than it used to be. So that's probably good. Once you have these HTML files, there are a few things you might want to do to them. To either, you might want to remove these inline styles, so this whole head section could probably be removed. And then if you want to remove inline styles, there are some tools that will do this, like this tool down here, HTML Cleaner, where we can just paste this in and clean this. And we remove those styles if you need to do that. And I'll link these tools down below. And when you have this HTML, you can either put this directly into your HTML editor, or the other thing you might do is that if you have like an upload from CSV tool, what we can do is take this HTML and we can go to minify it. Now we have this HTML string. And what we can actually do with this is if we went back to our keyword research tool, we might have a column called like body, and then we can put this actual HTML in here. And then if you have a tool that like uploads from CSV or a plugin, there's a pretty good chance that you can relatively easily just put this body in here. Then we have all the fields. And with a upload from CSV tool or plugin for WordPress or whatever, you should be able to handle and upload in massive bulk. So if you had like 100 of these, you could set it up so that these fields align with the various fields you need to fill out on WordPress or your content management system or wherever. And then you just have the raw HTML source, and then that will upload correctly via the CSV uploading tool. Once you've uploaded that content, you're pretty much done with your basic on-page SEO. There are a few things that you might also do afterwards. One of the first things you might check in on is to see if the page is indexed. So if we look for site, whatever the path is, so this would be like path to article, we can check to see if that page is actually showing in Google's index. You can also check to see if a page has been cached. So if we do cache :URL, we'll get something like this, and we can see this page has been last cached on this particular date, April 9th. Now, there's a good chance this page has been crawled again since then, as the last public cached version that's showing is not always the same as the last time the page has been crawled. And it's not always the same as what's actually in the Google index. Regardless, this is still a relatively useful tool that you can use to check to see if a page is in fact indexed/crawled, and between that and the site key and the cache key, you should be able to determine whether your page has been crawled. Another thing you can do if you have your own analytics is you can figure out when is the last time Googlebot actually made a request to this page, and then you could actually make a custom tool for your site. There might be a WordPress plugin that does this, that tells you when Google has last crawled your pages, which should actually be relatively easy to do. Anyway, once your site has been crawled and your content has been processed by search engines, you can also keep track of your rankings through tools like Ahrefs, SERPbook, or even just manually monitoring your position in search results for the keywords that you're going after. You can also use your analytics data, of course, to see whether that page is getting traffic, since that generally indicates that it would be ranking, as you can also adjust your analytics reports depending on what tool you're using to figure out where is that traffic coming from. Is it from organic search? Is it from social media? And so on. And that'll give you a good idea of how well you're doing. You might also revisit pages over time. That's generally a good idea. It seems to be true that pages that are updated more frequently tend to do better in search results. While that sounds like some guru trash, it's definitely something that I've seen, and I know Hash Brown has expressed that that is something he has also seen in terms of like blog comments. Like pages that get more blog comments seem to do better in search results, possibly because either there's content that's coming in that's fresh, or because it's a sign that they're being engaged with or something. And again, I know that sounds like some guru bullshit. It seems to be the case that that is true. And algorithmically, it would be relatively easy to detect, so it actually does make sense. So it is a good idea to go back and update posts as relevant. You can also do things like add structured data and improve that to try to help your click-through rate. Go back in and maybe add more content or more images and so on. If a post is doing well, it's a good idea to go back in and try to snowball that post. So rather than trying to save your terrible posts that are just failing miserably, try to take your posts that are doing very well and make them succeed as hard as possible, and then carry the rest of your site. Anyway, with all these tricks, you should be able to do a good job of producing content at whatever scale that you need, making sure that it's understood and processed by search engines for your keywords, and to ensure that you can get a good click-through rate from users who are viewing that content. That's all I have for this post. Get the fuck out. Let's see, what's a good way to end this post. Alright, hopefully you could hear that. Get the fuck out.